All right. Let's get things going. Good evening. This is Neil, W2NDG from Highland, starting the Sunday night 8 o'clock Science and Technology Net on the 146.805 repeater of the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club. We meet here every Sunday night at 8 p.m. to discuss science and technology, not always ham radio related, but sometimes it is. Tonight we are open topic. Partly because I know there's a distraction on primetime television, something about a ball being tossed around, I don't know, some sort of thing like that. Anyway, we'll see who's around tonight and see if we come up with a topic. I know I got asked a question earlier that I did not know the answer to, and actually I apologize to Mike if he's on tonight. I got busy and I didn't really have time to look into it, but Mike wanted to know if a DirecTV satellite dish could be used for anything ham radio related. And it's a good question. And if nobody knows the answer, maybe I'll do a little research on that. So anyway, let me drop. I'm usually joined on Sunday nights by my partner in crime here, Jim K2BHM. I know Jim was having a finger food bowl, hors d'oeuvres and pizza and everything else. If he's watching the game, that's fine. But let me see if Jim's around. Jim, are you here?
The pizza was excellent. Yeah, I'm learning a lot about making dough and the science of making pizzas and so forth. Book that I got for Christmas basically expands on the science and technology of food ingredients and how they differ and how to deal with the differences and so forth. So I'm having fun, and I could care less about football. What they do to that pigskin is their problem, and the money that's involved in it is disgusting and so forth, but that's my opinion. Other people, your mileage may vary. K2BHM.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely get into a whole conversation on that. We started to talk about it the other day on here, about what happens if you try to use the term Super Bowl in anything. I even had to hold back as I was typing the description of tonight's class, knowing that if I used the S word in the description of the class, my YouTube video would probably get pulled. It's just insane. But what kind of verifies what you're saying, Jim, is I forget how many years ago it was, but when everybody just started changing the wording and they couldn't charge people anymore for using the S word, the Super Bowl Commission tried to trademark the phrase "the big game," and they were pretty much laughed out of court. But there we go. All right. So, we could talk about the science of bread dough. What makes it work? What makes bread bread? I don't know. There's a possibility. But let's see who's around tonight. We'll go to check-ins early. And to check into the net, you're going to throw me your call sign, your name, and your location. Please come in.
This is WA2RKN. Jerry. Hi, Mark. And pigskins, huh? I think they're deep fried. Tastes pretty good. This is KD2MNR, Mike of Poughkeepsie.
Net control. Here is KB2, GGF, Matt in Kerhonkson.
All right. Well, we have our regulars, and pretty much have the crowd I was expecting. We might get a few more when we call for some check-ins later, but no, this is cool. So, um, yeah, hunting for a topic, folks. And if anybody does know more about what Mike's question was earlier, you can spout on that. Um, so let's go back to Jim. Jim, do you have anything in particular you want to talk about? Like I said, maybe the science of dough. Actually, it is interesting how it all works, and um, it's a product of several things all coming together and working at the same time.
Yes, definitely. Oh God, it's a lot more complicated than that. I didn't realize how complicated it was, how many variables there is. Um, uh, you basically have to um, try everything out, and when you find something you like and it works, stick with that product and hope they maintain their quality control. Um, and every aspect of it has different variables that can affect the way the product comes out. So it's not a simple throw in 3 cups of flour, a cup of water, a package of yeast, and you're on the go. No, it's a lot more complicated than that, and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface yet. Wow, a whole new era. And dishes. That could be an interesting topic too. There's some parameters there that have to be addressed. So we can go everywhere. It's open talk, Mike. So whoever picks it up and goes with the topic, we'll run with it and see where it takes us. That's half the fun of it. So back to you, Neil, K2BHM.
All right. The science of dough. There's 2 sides to it. One side being not as scientific. So, in the science of it, when you work dough, and part of making bread, making dough, is that you need to knead it, knead with a K, and that's the process of working the dough. And what happens, when you work wheat dough made from wheat grain, wheat flour, something in the dough called gluten, which has earned a terrible name in pop culture. Everybody thinks that they have a problem with gluten. Actually, only a very small percentage of the public has issues digesting gluten. But gluten is a protein. It's actually the part of wheat that doesn't really have carbohydrates. It's protein. And when you work dough, gluten becomes very elastic. And it's what gives bread dough that really elastic texture, is when you work it. And this is why when you make something like pancakes or muffins, you don't want that texture. Who wants a rubbery pancake? Ew. So they tell you when you read the directions for making things like pancakes and muffins to mix it as little as possible and get a uniform texture out of it. And that's because you want those things to be delicate. You want them to be fork tender, to fall apart. Biscuits, of course, are famous for that. But no, not with bread. Bread, you want that elasticity, partly because it's the texture. It's what we like about bread. But the other problem is it's what makes it work. This is W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday night, Bread and Buns Net. Anyway, so why elasticity? Because the way bread works is it's puffed up with gas. And that gas creates little tiny gas pockets in the dough as it bakes and leaves us with that spongy, elasticy thing that we call bread. But the other side of this, like I said, there are two parts, is that you're going to get all of this science to work, but it still needs to taste good. So it's ratios. It's wheat flour does make it taste good, and a certain amount of yeast gives it a certain flavor. And basic bread dough is simply just flour, water, and yeast, and a little bit of sugar to get the yeast going. But there's other things that you can throw in there. Sometimes milk, sometimes dry milk, sometimes a fat of some sort, whether butter or oil or something to that effect. Spices, salt. Salt is actually a functional ingredient in that it inhibits the yeast growth, and sugar enhances the yeast growth. And they do it at different points during the process. So you get different results by varying those ratios as well. Moisture ratios give you completely different results. I've played enough with this that I know, something goes wrong, you look it up and it says, well, the top of your loaf rose fine, and then the last 5 minutes of baking, it sank a little bit. And they tell you what that means and what you need to adjust. So we have science, we have the recipe, which actually makes it taste good. Then you can put other things in there. You can shape it. You can do all sorts of things with it. There's tricks you can do with the outside of it to make it look a certain way when it's done. And it all goes into something that is such an important part of our culture. So then the gas itself is a science. I had a biology teacher in middle school who used to refer to alcohol as yeast crap. And he'd say, so when your father comes home from work tonight, he's going to ask your mother to make him a glass of yeast crap. It's an oversimplification, but so when yeast becomes active, you give it some moisture and you give it some sugar to eat, it expels gas, I believe carbon dioxide gas, and it grows and it multiplies. So the yeast itself grows, and the new yeast that it creates continues to eat the sugar and produce more gas. And that's what makes the bread rise. But there are other methods that work as well. So there's non-biological methods, soda, whether baking soda, or actually there are breads that use a little bit of club soda as well, seltzer. There are different agents that produce gas just sitting, and we get things like Irish soda bread. There's baking powder, which is a mixture of baking soda and other agents that give off a little bit of fizz when they get hot. Those are non-biological ways. But there's a couple other ways that are biological that aren't yeast. We frequently hear of sourdough. Sourdough is a thin, cultured dough. You basically let it go bad. It's picking up a certain kind of biological, I believe it's a bacteria, and it grows, kind of like how you do yogurt. So you take a sample from your previous batch and you save it, and then when you make your next batch, you mix a little bit of that starter or the sample in it, let it sit, and it'll start to grow again. And you keep saving a little piece of each batch, and it goes forward. And there are people who have been using the same sourdough culture for years and years, and it just evolves. And sourdough bread has a little more elastic texture to it and a slight sour taste, like we like with yogurt. It adds a bit of a tang to the bread. And there's all sorts of weird ones. One of the ones, and if anybody has a copy of Joy of Cooking, it's in there. It's one of the places I first read about it. Potato salt rising bread is interesting. And it relies on a bacteria that grows well in potato pulp, but it's salt resistant. And why do we do that? So we don't get other things growing that we don't want. So you make like a potato pulp and you let it sit at a certain temperature and it will eventually go bad. It gets sour. And what it is it's a certain bacteria that it's going to pick up that's airborne that is salt resistant. And it's going to grow and it gives off gas, just like a lot of these other things. There's several different names for that kind of bread, and it's tricky. It's not always easy to do, but I haven't tried it yet. I was going to try it back at the beginning of the pandemic when I was getting into this stuff, but never got into it. So anyway, so that's just an overview of how it works. And let me throw it back to Jim for comment, and then we'll go on to Jerry, Mike, and Matt.
Thanks, Neil. Well, yeah, there is so many variables. Let's just look at yeast for a minute. There's the standard cake yeast. There's rapid rise yeast. There's bread yeast. There's activated dry yeast. There's whatever. And now when you start getting into making beer and wine, there's hundreds of different varieties of yeast. And basically what it boils down to is yeast exists naturally in the environment. And when you're doing something and it gets exposed to yeast, it basically starts working on your product. And if you like what you get, yay. If you don't, you throw it out. So when you get something that works, you try and preserve it and make it replicate and multiply and keep it. So like that's why you got a sourdough starter. And that's why you are very careful about airlocking your wine and your beer to keep anything extraneous getting into it, because you don't want contamination from other yeast products other than the one that you're introducing for that particular flavor and quality that you want. It's very scientific. Let me drop a second. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. When you start talking about pizza, you've got those situations with the yeast. You've got the flour, how much gluten is there, how much did they crack the grain, how much of one particular part of the grain went into it, and how much of the other went in, certain particular ratios. There's so many different variables. They even get down to the temperature of the water that you mix the dough with, because if you're going to mix it by hand, the temperature may raise 2 or 3 degrees. But if you use a commercial mixer with a dough hook, it can raise the temperature 40 degrees. And so now you have to very drastically change the temperature of the water that you use to make the dough to compensate for the heat that you're putting in with the mixer action. So heck, it's crazy. I never dreamed it was this complicated. Back to you, Neil, K2PHM.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a lot of science in it. And I'll say one last comment on this, and then we'll go around for more on this or other topics. And I was poking a little bit at the satellite dish question while you were speaking, Jim. Contamination. Yes. So a lot of these things are naturally occurring, and it's definitely easy, to make these things happen. Yeah, Mike. Yes, we're talking about dough because there's so much science in it. It really is science, and that's what makes it work. We don't think about it that way, but I'll give you one last thing on this to show you how scientific it is. When contamination does happen, very strange things can occur. Twice in my life, I have picked up a loaf of bread at the supermarket, opened it up, and instead of that wonderful, fresh, slightly yeasty bread smell, it smelled like nail polish remover, or more clearly, acetone. And although it wasn't actually acetone, and I looked into the chemical reaction that causes this, it's related to acetone chemically, and it's a contamination that can occur during the processing and packaging of the bread, where the wrong thing is basically making the bread rise and attacking it. And one of the funny things about this process, you open up a loaf of bread and it shouldn't smell like nail polish remover, obviously. And when I searched for it on the internet, W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. When I searched for it on the internet, the funny thing was that there were definitely people asking, why does my bread smell about acetone? But there were always people, anytime I've looked this up, that were asking, can I eat it? Oh my God, if you open a loaf of bread and it smells like acetone, why would you want to eat it? That's just such a silly question for me. Anyway, let's go down the list now. And once again, you don't have to talk about dough. You can talk about something else that you want to talk about. And first is Jerry, WA2RKN.
Greetings. Yes, go. Good stuff. I love the smell of fresh bread. Paper locking here. Jim, I've heard you mention in the past about your new book, and was hoping that you would mention the title again. I am by no means a great baker, but I do enjoy making bread occasionally. We've tried making baguettes, etc. And the comment about the yeast, yes, it's free floating in the air, and it will get into your stuff. But there are different species of yeast. In particular, the San Francisco variety is where the sourdough came from and started, because of the particular variety of yeast that's floating around in the air out there. So if you try to start a sourdough batch from scratch, your results are going to be different depending on what part of the country you're in. Satellite dishes. Well, the key here is it's a parabola, or a section of a parabola with the offset feeds. That's good for any frequencies, as long as the surface accuracy of the dish is better than 1/10 of a wavelength at the frequency you're interested in. I do have some questions, though. I was looking briefly at some dishes and stumbled across mesh parabolic dishes. And one of the things that really struck me is this one place was talking about the mesh, and it was galvanized, which surprised me. I thought maybe they'd be using aluminum or perhaps copper or something, but the galvanized mesh for a dish kind of made me scratch my head. Didn't think that they would do that because of the conductivity, but apparently they do. WA2RKN, back to that.
Jim, you want to give the title of the book again?
Yeah, it's called The Joy of Pizza by Dan Richer. He has a pizzeria down in Jersey, and he's been studying it. He's a CAA graduate. He's been studying cooking and pizza and so forth for like 20 years.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll look that one up myself. All right. And Mike just sent me a link. And I know it's talking about one of the things that I've already read here. So I'm going to cover that as well. Hold on. Let me open this one up. So there's a couple of answers here to Mike's question. And before I bring him on here, I'm going to mention them. So small satellite TV dishes are about 20 inches in diameter. And basically the article I'm reading says too small to be using them for 2 meter, 1.25 centimeter, 1.25 meters, and 70 centimeter or 440. And it says it could work for 440, but the gain is really, really low. You'd be better off with the Yagi. But it says that when you get up to 1.2 gig and 2.4 gig, these small dishes do start giving you some worthwhile gain. At 1.2, It tells you it's about 14 dB at 2.4 gigahertz, about 20 dB. And it says a small dish works great at 10 gigahertz, which is something Jerry's been talking about a lot, where you get, it says, about 32 dB of gain. Now, obviously, when you're doing this, you're dealing with something that is highly directional, which when we get up into those higher frequencies, we are dealing with something that's really directional. And you're going to be aiming it at whatever you're trying to work. It's definitely something that could work for something. So that's the one direction to go in. Let me drop. The other thing, which is what Mike sent me a link for, is that you can convert one of these small satellite TV antennas into a slot antenna, which could be built for 2 meter, possibly even 440. And that's where you cut a slot into the dish, which changes its characteristics. And it's no longer a passive reflector, but now an active element in an antenna. And they said it's a good way to get a stealthy ham antenna. If you live in a place where they allow the small satellite dishes for TV, but nothing else, you could kind of put one up and hide a ham radio antenna that way. So that is something you can do with it. And let's talk to Mike, KD2MNR.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I was looking at that, and they're saying it's good for 2 meter, but, and yeah, it's stealthy. The thing is, when we moved into this house, it was my wife's grandparents' house, and my wife's aunt paid for, I don't know if it's Dish Network or Network, Direct TV, the Dish. It's up on the tower. And I can get to that one to take it down and do something with it. If I could do something with it, that would be great. It's a free antenna. I just have to alter it, which you all know me. I love a good project. If that's possible, because Linda brought it up before. She says, is there anything you can do with that dish? Or I don't know. And, so that's when I texted you, Neil. But yeah, I mean, once it warms up a little bit, I can get up there and get it down and try and do something with it, So there was another, let me drop. If you're looking at that PDF I sent you, down towards the bottom, you're actually not using the cone on it, but you're actually doing a 6-turn balance behind it, and you're actually attaching, your coax right to the dish on either side of the slot that you cut in. The only thing is, where exactly is that slot? Going by the picture, it doesn't give you any measurements. I don't know if it matters. I'm sure it matters, but kind of look at the picture of it, look at the one you have, and kind of figure it out, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was saying. If you're going to use it for 1.2, 2.4, or 10 gig, you're using it as a reflector, a passive reflector. And you still need, something at the, let's say, it's not focal point, but you know what I'm saying. You need something at that convergence point to transmit and receive then. But yeah, a slot antenna, the metal itself becomes the antenna and is no longer a passive radiator for it. So anyway, it's just it's an interesting way to look at it. I've read about slot antennas more than once. They're interesting. There's a number of different ways to make them. And it's definitely a way to make a stealthy antenna, because there are a number of metal things that we could put up around the house that could definitely look like something else that you could cut a slot antenna into. So it's just something to consider. Back to you, Mike. But
now it becomes
2-meter one or anything, it is a directional antenna, right? It's a beam.
Yes, to some extent. If you look further up in that PDF, it gives you a rough radiation and elevation pattern for it, so you get an idea what it looks like. It basically acts like a dipole as opposed to a Yagi, so it's a bidirectional antenna in that regard. It's going to pretty much transmit and receive in a plane in opposite directions just as well. Whereas a Yagi does have a certain amount of reception and transmission off of its back end, but it's much less than its front end. This thing is pretty much like a dipole. So if you're going to point it to the north, you're also going to get it to the south. That's how this one works. Anyway, interesting. And if you have the raw materials, it's definitely worth a try. It gives you a backup antenna, a secondary one that doesn't look like all of your other antennas. It's even something you could stick on top of the trailer when you're out and about camping somewhere, and it would just look like a satellite dish antenna. People wouldn't even realize that you were operating amateur radio at that point. So anyway, W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. Back to Mike for final comment, and we'll go to Matt.
Yeah, well, and the other thing I like in that PDF, there's the entire 2-meter band. The way he has this set up is, it goes at the edges of the band. The SWRs is 1.5, and then at the center of the band at 146, it's like down to almost nothing. So, did I do this, the beep of death? Hang on. All right, so, that's a good sign also, and like we said, you do it, you cut the slot in it, you do what you got to do, and you put it on the analyzer and see where it's good. I could do 2-meter band with my analyzer. That's as low as I can go, but I know other people with analyzers that can probably do 440 or 1200, stuff like that. I know a couple of people. So back to you, Neil. KD2 MNR. Thank you.
No, you're welcome, Mike. And always interesting to look at stuff like this. So definitely something to try. And if you read, slot antennas are nothing new. They're used in industry. It's just never been very popular in our hobby, but it could definitely work at a frequency like 2 meters. Let me drop. All right. Next up is Matt, KB2GGF. So combine these two things, Matt, and make a slot antenna out of dough.
Or a pizza oven with a parabolic reflector and sunlight. Interesting stuff. Both topics. Let me address the satellite dish for the dish TV or satellite whatever. The over-the-air satellite stuff. I often see those dishes being thrown away. The standard mounting pole, which they sort of strangely call a J-pole, well, it has a J shape, but it's not a J-pole antenna, it's a J-pole mount. Useful mounts, really good for mounting a weather station or an antenna, or as an anchor point for a support wire for a wire antenna, a support rope for a wire antenna. They're pretty useful for that. I've looked into repurposing those dish subscription dish antennas to receive free to-air satellite TV. And bottom line is they can work, but they probably won't work too well. Let me drop it. And So far as a mesh dish being galvanized, I think Jerry brought that up. I have a 12-foot dish in my backyard, and it is mesh, and it's steel mesh. I don't know if it's galvanized or not because it's very heavily painted. Well, it came that way from the factory, and after 30 years, or 35 years, it's still very heavily painted. So I assume that's a dielectric, but I could be wrong. And what else? Okay, yes, yeast, wild yeast. There's a beer in Belgium called Lambic, which is a sour beer. It gets the sour from the lactobacillus, and it uses wild yeast. Literally in the brew house, they have big open vats, and they open up the skylights and let the air come in, and that's how they pitch the yeast in their brewing. Location, location, location. As you were saying about the San Francisco strain of sourdough. Same with the Lambic beer. Very parallel. Let me drop it. I used to brew a bit of beer, actually ale, technically. And yeast do interesting things based on temperature and sugar and light and other influences, being agitated, shaking the bottle while it's flocculating. Yes, they flocculate when they reproduce. They make fusel oils as a byproduct as well of their metabolism. Fusel oils have some interesting properties. One of them is scent. I've brewed many batches of ale where if the temperature is a little too high, it'll make it smell like a banana, which is kind of weird. Not very pleasant to me, anyway. Another one is an apple smell. It's a very distinct green apple smell, and it's quite pleasant with an ale. And a third one that I've encountered, which is a fusel oil byproduct, smells like Band-Aids. It has an almost iodine Band-Aidy smell to it, and that's really not nice. It's like Band-Aid in your beer. Not too pleasant, but interesting stuff. So that's all my scattered comments, and great net tonight. So back to net. KB2 GGF.
Comment.
All right. That's Mike with a comment, but I do have to make one myself real quick. Matt, the last time I heard the term fusel oil, it was spoken by Robbie the Robot. Go, Mike.
I once had a car stereo amplifier. It was a 400-watt amp, and anytime you would turn up the radio and be really, really loud, like when your hair shakes, that kind of loud, you would smell. For lack of a better term, it smelled like burning Band-Aids. It never got real hot or anything like that, but that smell was coming from the amp.
I know that smell. Yeah, I've smelled that one. There's the quote 400-watt amp, unquote. We used to get stuff like that at those Civic Center car audio sales where the announcer would come on and go, "Any other deal is no big deal." I used to love to go to those and get some cool stuff out of it. But yeah, that's something I've smelled as well. Matt, you know my Robbie the Robot reference, I assume.
Yes, the cook has Robbie make up a whole bunch of bourbon.
Yes. All right. Anyway, we've reached the end of our round. We've discussed dish antennas and slot antennas and dough and yeast and even some brewing. But before I take more check-ins, I'm going to throw it up to Jerry because I'm sure he might have something to say about using a dish for 10 gig.
someday soon. Um, yeah, as you noted, the gain of the dish of a fixed size goes up depending on the wavelength you're trying to focus. Yeah, and skeleton slot antennas. Did a quick look online while you guys were chatting, and this is different from my understanding of a skeleton slot antenna. I believe the skeleton slot antenna originated with military aircraft, where they needed an antenna that would not protrude from the fuselage, and they wound up just cutting a slot in the fuselage, and I'm assuming, fill it with like epoxy or something to not interrupt the airflow smoothly, the laminar airflow, and they would feed the antenna at the midpoint of the slot on opposite sides, so you had like a dipole, and that's not what I'm seeing here on online. So yeah, I guess I got some reading to do to see where this has evolved into. Matt, I keep hearing comments about satellite dishes people are throwing out. I would be very pleased to find out where these people are, so they could throw them out my way. WA2RKN, back to net.
Thanks, Jerry. And yeah, the article I was looking at used the aircraft antenna as one of the examples. And there's other things like that also. So neat stuff. All right. Let's see if there's anybody else who wants to check in. And then I think we're going to do one more round and call it tonight. Like I said, I wanted to make tonight's net short. And we can all watch the end of the big game. All right. Anybody else who would like to check in, please come now with your name, your call sign, and your location.
Bobby Kerhonkson, KV2, RWW.
All right. Kerhonkson's winning the Sunday Night Net Bowl here, folks. We have a very large percentage of Kerhonkson attendance. Bob, if you've been listening, please comment on anything you've heard so far. If you haven't been, ask me and I'll bring you up to date.
I just got on about 3 minutes ago, so the only comments I would actually have is I do a lot with microwave and repurposing dishes. Of course, the larger the dish, the higher the gain, and figuring out the focal point isn't all that hard. It's a fairly easy calculation, which can be found on the internet and everything. Let me drop. I operate from 1.2 gig to 10 gig, and hopefully as soon as I get done putzing around, I'm hoping to be on 24 gig. But as far wise as antennas for HOAs, there's many different antennas you can use. Don't forget your vent pipe. You can extend that and turn that into a really nice antenna, and it doesn't take too much. As far wise as slotted antennas, they're great for transmitting, and not so much for receiving. Their main purpose for such as radar for aircraft and that, they're great for transmit. They get your signal out there in a nice tight lobe. I do have a couple of slotted homemade antennas here. But when you get down into the 2 meter range and that, it becomes extremely large and a little hard to hide. And with that, I'm going to return it back to net. Give me 2 RWW.
All right. Thanks, Bob. And yeah, we were talking about what you can do with old DirecTV antennas. And the other topic we started out with was the science of bread and bread dough, in case you want to say anything on that.
I don't have much in science for that. If I don't get my mixture right, it won't rise. And if it don't rise, don't eat it.
Yeah, it does get kind of funky when it doesn't do that. Plus, you don't know what contaminated it. Good point. Okay, we're going to pump it back up to the top and go through one more time here. And any topic is fair game. Either of the two we've hit on so far, or if there's something new you want to bring up. So let's go up to Jim, K2 via Jim.
Thanks, Neil. Well, lots of comments. Let's see if I can remember them all. Yeah, dishes, interesting. If a dish is designed for 12 gigs, the accuracy of the surface is going to be within a certain percentage of the frequency. If it's designed for 4 gigs C-band, it's going to be a different thing. So don't expect to do 12 gig work on a dish that was designed for 4 gigs. There's an F-to-D ratio. The F-to-D ratio and the frequency you're operating on is going to determine the beam angle and all kinds of things like that. There's so many different parameters to look at. And just think about it. You got a satellite way up and then way beyond. And if it's transmitting on 12 gig, the frequency and the beam angle and all that is such that you can do it with a 2-foot dish. If you're going down to 4 gigs C-band, you need a 10-foot dish. So there's some ratios there that are pretty important and play in and so forth. So anyhow, something to think about. And let's get back to yeast. Let me drop a second. Yeah, pizza dough in the past. Oh yeah, you throw some water, some flour, some yeast, some sugars, and salt, and so forth, and mix it all up and throw it together, let it rise, and make the dough and make a pizza. Okay. This guy has a process over 3 days, and he does multiple risings and multiple kneadings and stuff like that. And he doesn't use sugar, so there's nothing to supplement the yeast for nutrients. I don't know how that works or not, but I'm playing with that. And he does just the water, flour, and yeast to start with. And you don't put the salt in because salt inhibits the growth of the yeast, the activation of the yeast. So he lets the dough sit and mature for an hour before you go and mix the salt in. And then I found out that our hot air fryer has a dehydrate mode. So I can go and set the thing at 100 degrees for 2 hours, put the blob of dough in there, put a little bit of water down the bottom, and I got a proofer. So that works. And then we get to beer. Let me drop again. I knew that was coming. So anyhow, yeah, when I first started brewing beer, you'd make an amber or something like that, and you'd let it age for a couple of weeks, and it would mature, and you'd have a nice beer. And I did a nice dark porter, let it age for a couple of weeks, and it was like, eh. And then after a month, it was like, well, this is getting better. After 2 months, it was like, oh, this is good. And so then I did a Belgian. And like you say, the yeast has interesting properties. I tried the Belgian after a month. It was like, well, this was a waste of time. Tried it after a couple months. Well, I don't need the keg. I won't throw it out. So I let it sit for about 9 months. And all of a sudden, whoa, this is good. It had some interesting properties, bananas, nuts, fruits, and so forth and so on. But it didn't have any of that in it. It was all the properties enhanced by the yeast. So there's a lot more going on than we anticipate. So cooking is an art. Throw a little bit of this in, a little bit of that, and it tastes good, and so forth and so on. But baking is a science. Brewing everything is a science. Everything has to be done in a certain specific sequence with certain temperatures and properties and delays and so forth and so on. And if you don't do it, it don't work. So anyhow, that's half the fun. Back to you, Neil, K2BHM.
Oh yeah, I mean, W2NDG on the OMARC Science and Technology Net 4ID. Before the pandemic, and when we had a different makeup of office staff at my job, there were a bunch of guys who were really, really into microbrews. And sometimes on Fridays after work, we would go to this place down by, I guess the bridge would, it's what they call the Koch Bridge now, right around 59th Street. Of course, it was always called the 59th Street Bridge years ago. There's a bar there that's known for its assortment of local and microbrews. It's called the Jeffrey. And they also have really good food. And we would gather there and try a lot of different things. And they would have different things on special each night. And they had, you get something to eat and a couple of beers, and they would have a deal, where you order something to eat and you get your choice of certain things on the beer menu. And yes, Lambics, it's one of the sour beers. There's a couple others that go in that direction. And one of the ones that I used to order there, which I believe is called a Goza, which is another style of sour beer, had a grapefruit flavor to it. And there's so many nuances to doing this. And this is, I have a friend who went to school to become a sommelier. And it's the same thing with wine. There just, differences of a degree or two during a couple of days of the processing, or it's just so many different variables that produce things. And the chance of reproducing exactly what you did the first time are not really there. You can get close, but that's why, a lot of these microbreweries, they'll come up with something, and it's almost like a wine vintage, and each year's batch slightly different sometimes. Interesting stuff, and definitely a lot of variables go into it. Thank you, Jim. Next up is Jerry, WA2RKM.
My comment is about the baking. I was coming home from high school one day after high school chemistry, and it suddenly struck me: why don't they weigh the ingredients when you're cooking and baking? Well, I guess if you are a good baker, you do weigh the ingredients rather than going, well, a cup of this and a teaspoon of that. You have to weigh your ingredients. Science demands it. WA2RKM, back to that.
And it's a good point, because, in so many recipes, we're measuring things by volume. And then you start having discussions about the density of certain ingredients. It's a good point. It really is. And there's certain things that are weighed when the professionals do it, as opposed to just measured. So, something to consider. Mike, KD2MNR, your turn on the science and technology.
Well, I'm looking on YouTube, and there's a ton of videos on how to do this, so I'm going to give it a try. So one of these days, I'm going to be talking to you through a satellite dish. I think that'll be pretty cool. Yeah, I think that's about it. So there's one guy that basically just straps an antenna on where the cone used to be, and basically using the dish itself as a reflector, I guess, chuck it on there in 30 seconds, and you're done. I don't know about that, but I am going to try and do something with this thing because, it's up there useless right now. So if I can do something with it and make it resonate somewhere, why not? Anyway, that's it for me. So I will turn it back to Neil. This is KD2MNR. Good night.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you for participating tonight. And Jerry, I looked up that book, by the way, and you probably already have as well, but while I was sitting here, looks like Amazon has it in hardcover for $26.55, and the Kindle version is on sale for $16.99. Looks like a cool book. I may go searching for a copy or just buy it outright. Anyway, it looks neat. Matt, KB2GGF, last round.
Thanks, Neil. And what Jim was saying about it being a science, I was very interested in that because indeed it is. If you want to produce consistently good results and results that are consistent from one time to another, you need to employ science and you need to keep records and you need to replicate what you've done before as closely as possible. That being said, there will always be variables, especially in a home setting. In an industrial setting, there's much more control. For example, Budweiser, which I don't really consider to be very good beer, is amazingly consistent. It is always the same wherever you go, every time. So they do achieve that. But for me, baking and brewing has always been much more of an art. Let me drop it. Where I follow very closely instructions and recipes the first couple of times I do it. But if I am baking or brewing in a frequent pattern, if I do it often, I'm very good at just judging. I don't measure things. I just know how much I need to put in and how to do it. I have the basic parameters for success internalized, and I just operate from there. And that's the way I was taught. I was taught by a lot of old cooks, and I taught myself brewing, but, it was a very seat of the pants kind of thing. But you have to have a good memory, and you have to have a sense of subtlety. But I guess that's the art part of it. And that's what I've leaned more into than the science, just because I'm lazy. Anyhow, great net. Thank you very much. KB2 GGF. Back to net.
W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. Thank you, Matt. And yes, it's art and science and experience. I do a lot of cooking. I don't do a lot of bread making. I've gotten into it, but I don't do that much. I've made some interesting things. But when I cook, I'm similar, Matt. I'll start with a recipe and then I start modifying it. And you learn from experience. And there's certain things you add a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you know how much. You know that if you started with 2 eggs and you're making, like a frying batter, you know roughly how much flour to put in it because you know the consistency you're aiming for. It's the same thing, a lot of the things that I make. It's you kind of feel your way through, or ingredient substitutes. Sometimes I'll pick up a recipe that calls for cracker crumbs or breadcrumbs, and to make it healthier for me, I'll change that over to almond meal. And there's definitely different dynamics you get out of doing that when you start substituting ingredients. And frequently I have really good results, and every now and then I fail. And it happens. But my family has gotten to a point now where they kind of trust me when I come up with things. And every now and then I'll invent something that, they'll say, can you make that again? And that's always, it makes you feel good. And that's one of the reasons why, Jim's making pizza, and we talk about home brewing and all these things. The reason why we create these things, it's the same reason why I like to build radios, because the end result is cool and it works and you can actually use it and somebody is impressed by it. It's neat. I made this with my hands and now we're going to talk to people around the world with it, or we're going to eat it. Hopefully those aren't interchangeable with the same thing. All right. Bob, KB2RWW, you are the last one up on the round here before we close things.
KB2RWW. All right. Well, as far as cooking, I learned a lot of my great-grandmother's recipes for different breads and cakes. It's all written down, but it's written down in a dash of this, a pinch of that. And I'm the only one, of course, I spent a lot of time with her. I learned what her pinch was and what her dash was, and I'm able to reproduce it, but when somebody else in the family takes the same recipe and tries to follow it, it never comes out the same. And as far as satellite dishes, the large ones, the larger the dish, the lot better they are. Although you kind of want a solid dish, the mesh dishes are okay, but on certain frequencies, it just passes right through the dish. Let me drop. And depending on the frequency you're going to operate at, sometimes putting a log periodic either pointed at the dish to use it as a reflector, or to put it behind to help use it as a director, or no, I think I got that backwards. But in any event, most of all my feeds that I do with my microwave stuff is homemade feed horns using copper plumbing fittings or copper flashing, and just bend it up into a square or rectangular feed horn and make my little matching stub and then go with it. Other than that, I am going to turn it back to Nat. KB2RWW.
Well, thank you, Bob. And thanks for being here tonight. Yeah, my mother was the youngest in her family, and I was the youngest in my family. I never got to spend a lot of time with her mother, my maternal grandmother, and she was known for some of her cooking. And I don't think anybody ever got some of those recipes. She had taken, common recipes and made her own versions of them. And I know one of the things, she was always famous for her chocolate chip cookies, which she called Toll House cookies, but they weren't. They were different. And she made something she called apple strudel, but it wasn't strudel. It was different. She had, kind of twisted a little bit of all this stuff and never really got to learn what a lot of it was. I did get a lot of my mother's recipes, which most of them were collected from other people. She wasn't a particularly inventive cook, but she was an accurate cook. And she was very good at following recipes and other instructions. But I did collect a number of the things she made that were my favorites. There was one that I didn't like, and I never got the recipe for, though, that became an interesting family staple and story. When I was a kid, one of the things that always showed up at family events on my mother's side of the family, because we used to get together quite a bit with my relatives, was a cold rice salad. And it was made with rice and mayonnaise and spices and peas and probably diced onions and peppers. I'm not sure what else went into it. I didn't like it, probably because I just detest peas. I can't stand peas, still to this day. I'll eat them raw out of the garden. I can eat snow peas if they're not overcooked, but I can't stand cooked peas. And my brother, Paul, used to make the rice salad. He had the recipe. And he was the one who made it after my parents retired and stopped doing stuff like that and moved away and eventually passed. But Paul always made the rice salad for things that he did. And when Paul passed away, he had told us to have a big party in his honor after he died. So we planned that. And multiple people kept saying, you should serve some rice salad. And a few of them even called it Paul's famous rice salad. And I, told a few of them, I said, well, it's actually not Paul's. it was like a family thing that none of us ever picked up on except him. Um, I'm not sure exactly where it originally came from, but I started hunting for the recipe because I figured even though I don't like it, I think it would be important to try to make it for this get together. My ex-wife, um, at the time, was heavily involved in my brother's exit from this world, and helping everybody out and being there for everybody. And she was instrumental in putting together this big party or get together. She decided she was going to try to recreate this dish based on what um, people had told her it was. Um, I don't know how close she got, but I called a few people in the family. Nobody had it. I was told that my aunt, who had moved to Washington, probably had the recipe. She said she had never made it. My mother always brought it, and no one else ever did. And right when I was about to give up and just go with my ex's recipe, about a day or two before, I got a call from an old friend of Paul's. And she said, I'll be there tomorrow. I've managed to clear the time and I'm going to come visit. And I'm bringing a cake and some cupcakes. And she listed all this thing and a big bowl of Paul's famous rice salad. And I said, you have the recipe. You're the one. And it was funny because so many people had come up with this. And even a couple people who didn't even consider it as a family thing just said, hey, anybody ever heard of cold rice salad? I might make some of that. That when that following year, when we decided to get together and put together a team for the Relay for Life walkathon that the Cancer Society does, we named our team Rice Salad. Got a lot of eyebrows with that, but if you've ever seen that when we do this, or anyone who's ever seen me wear the T-shirt, I have a T-shirt that says Rice Salad on it. It has a bowl of rice salad. That's where all that came from. And that is one of those, family recipes. I'd still love to know where it came from. Knowing my mother, it was probably in the middle of a Better Homes and Gardens magazine from 1971 or something like that. Anyway, the point of all of this is all of you, who may have had dishes handed down from people in your family, and you've collected things like that. Find them, write them down, make copies of them, whatever you have, collect them. We've been talking about doing this in my family, about putting together a huge family cookbook. And I've seen these. You go to yard sales sometimes and people are selling them. Do this. Food is one of the biggest legacies our families leave sometimes. And make sure you keep that stuff as part of your history. Write it down. That's all I can say. Don't lose it and hand it over to somebody else, whether it's children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, grandnieces, and nephews. Doesn't matter. Make sure somebody gets this. Because as time goes on, a lot of this stuff gets lost. All right. Is there anybody else with a late check-in and last-minute comment to everything we've been talking about tonight? Please come now.
KD2 TVS Lou, West Wilson.
All right. CJ, I am quite sure that you would have something to add to tonight's topic, but we have a few things we were talking about, and for both you and Lou's benefit, we started out actually talking about dough and yeast and bread, and then we went on to what can you do with an old DirecTV antenna, and the answers were use it as a microwave antenna for, like 1.2, 2.4 gig or 10 gig, or we were talking about using it as a slot antenna on 2 meters. And then we kind of expanded out on the idea of yeast and baking and cooking as science. And I just ended it with a little story about family recipes because I think it's important. But anyway, any of those things, but this is the final round. We're going to close things up early tonight. So, CJ, you're up first.
I've been listening for maybe 10 or 15 minutes of our good conversation. Awesome conversation, right? Let's see, direct TV dish. Don't forget to make a great target as well. Updating your family recipes, carrying that legacy forward. That's excellent. That's what inspired me to jump in and say hello. So with that, I'll put it back in my control. Nice to hear everyone here tonight. And great next. Carry on.
All right. Thanks, CJ. Appreciate you stopping by. All right. Lou, KD2 TVS. Well, you heard the synopsis. Sorry, such a short net tonight, but definitely have things I want to take care of before the workday tomorrow. So please come now. And that's Lou from West Milford.
Thank you, Neil. KD2 TVS here. I just walked in on the conversation about the rice salad. And as far as anything that I would have to add to the topics that you mentioned was, I agree. Those family recipes, the old ones that like that, and probably so many, and I'm sure that everybody on the net tonight probably has favorite things that your mom's made, grandmother's made, and stuff. And I happen to have gotten lucky that a lot of my favorites, my wife actually, because we were married so young, and basically knew each other since our teenage years. She stood alongside with my mom and actually learned to make a lot of the stuff which were my favorites. So when we got married, she already knew how to spoil me. So I agree. Those recipes have to continue to go on, and luckily, my daughter has basically been in the kitchen with my wife when she's made a lot of those. So, and she has her memories of her favorites from my mom, and that her mom now makes and stuff like that. So hopefully that'll continue on. And I know my son has a few of his favorites. So when my wife is gone, I'm sure his sister will be around to make the ones that he's fond of. So yeah, definitely an important thing. So, and as far as any of the other topics, no comments. But let me just reset. I do have one question to see if anybody on the net knows tonight that I was listening on because Steve K2GOG actually sent out that email about that balloon that West Point was sending up yesterday, and it was going up in somewhere. I forget the town in Pennsylvania, and they were supposed to bring it down somewhere near West Point. But as I'm following it on APRS, on the APRS.fi, that thing finally came down near Gillette Stadium, which is, as you know, is the Patriots Stadium up in New England, not too far from Boston. So I was just wondering if anybody knew what actually went on. I was searching on the net to see if there was any info, any comments, but I didn't see any. So back to you, Neil. KD2 TVS.
Well, thanks, Lou. And I did not. I didn't have a chance to follow it. Let me throw that out to the group here. Did anybody have a chance to pick up on the balloon event?
No.
All right. I know there was somebody I heard on the repeater today that said they were running to catch it. I think it was Ken AD2T who said that he was trying to get it. Lou, I don't know if you're around in the mornings, but Ken is almost always on the 8:35 net in the mornings, and you could probably catch him then, and he might be able to tell you how that went. But no, I did not myself. And I'll comment another family recipe story real quick, and this one's very quick, but it was just my father's side of the family. My father was an only child, so that there wasn't a lot of family to mingle with. But uh, there was a story my mother told when they were dating. My father was always raving about his mother's cooking. I never got to meet her. She passed long, long before I was born. But she made a lot of traditional New York Jewish dishes. And one of the things that she made was stuffed breast of veal. And my mother is the kind of person that can pick the fat out of hamburger. She couldn't stand fat on any of her meat. She would cut it off and freak out when there was a lot of fat on things. And she didn't know what stuffed breast of veal was. She had never had it. And I think part of the reason was is she grew up um, in a family that made her that way and didn't serve a lot of fat. So when she went to my father's family dinner and was served this, it was basically a plate of crispy fat with stuffing in it, stuffed fat. That's what stuffed breast of veal is. And she was horrified, and I can only imagine the expressions on her face as she tried to eat it and be polite. She was a terrible poker player. Anyway, that's it for me and the family and the net. And let's drop for final comments, and we will close the net.
I got a few comments. K2BHM.
I thought you might. I was going to mention you if you didn't pop up anyway. Jim, please, final comments, and then we'll close things up.
Thanks, Theo. You brought back a lot of memories with family recipes. My wife has a couple of favorite recipes from her mom and her grandmother. Now, I was fortunate enough to know her mom and experience the recipes firsthand and so forth. I didn't know her grandmother, but I have kind of taken these recipes and modified them and made them my own. And every time I make them, there's a little different twist because it depends on what's in the refrigerator that needs to be used up. So things can be tweaked and played with and have a lot of fun with. And that's half the fun of cooking. Don't try that with baking. So, but we covered that. Anyhow, yeah, back to another topic. Let me drop a second. Baking. Yes, when I make my pizza dough, I have a recipe, and it calls for a cup of this and 2 cups of that, and a teaspoon of this, and a packet of yeast, and so forth and so on, and everything is all laid out. And I do it the same way, the same exact scenario every single time, and it never comes out the same way twice. But this guy in the Joy of Pizza, he weighs everything, and that's a game changer. I've done a couple of recipes now, the same recipe a couple of times, and it's pretty much come out the same. Weight is obviously in baking a lot more important. And you've heard of the conventional math that we learned when we were kids, and now the Common Core math being totally radical and changed and so forth and so on. Well, there is baker's math. That's a totally different animal in itself. The sum is greater than the parts. If you're making something, you're going to put in, say, 25% this and 50% that and 10% this and 17% that and whatever, and it all comes up to 100%. They don't do that in baking. Let me drop a second. Turns out in baking, the most important ingredient is flour. So, whatever flour you start with, that is 100%. So now if you're going to add 25% water by weight of the flour, and 2% salt by weight of the flour, and 0.5% yeast by weight of the flour, and so forth and so on, all of these percentages are with respect to the flour content being 100%. So you could add up to 120, 150, 175% ingredients for the recipe, which is kind of weird, but I guess it makes sense. They did it. They know what they're doing. They've been doing it for hundreds of years, and that math works. So it's not Common Core, it's not normal, but it works, and it's weird, but I'm going with it. So back to you, Neil. K2VHM.
No, thanks, Jim. And yeah, you're right. I remember my first few failures as a kid, finding that mom had bought yeast to make something and ended up not using it. I'm like, I'm going to make bread. And, just thinking about, the things that went into it and using way too much yeast, not understanding what kneading was or why it needed to happen. And I basically just made this terrible yeasty smelling dough lump. And then I was taught, Irish woman, retired lady who watched us a couple of times when my parents went on long vacations. She would come and stay with us. She was quite the cook, and she taught me a lot. And from that point on, I started, really trying to make dinner and do things, baking from scratch and stuff once in a while. Mom still did, 80% of the cooking. Every now and then Dad would run the kitchen and we'd all be scared. So, well, that's it for all of us. Let's close things up. You have been listening or participating in the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net, either via the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club's 146.805 repeater or on YouTube via the W2NDG Science and Technology channel on YouTube. We meet here every Sunday night at 8 p.m., but we are sponsored by the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club, which owns this repeater. And you do not have to be a member to participate in our net, but we encourage you to come check us out and possibly apply to be a member if you like what you see. We're a friendly bunch of people, and you can find us at omarcclub.org, omarcclub.org. And if you like what you heard here tonight, please come and join us for the rest of the nets that this club sponsors or runs. Every morning at 8:35 a.m., we run the 8:35 on the 805 Roundtable Net, a discussion of what people are doing, what they need, any issues they're having, just kind of like a regular diner discussion over breakfast that people would have. Paul and Bob, K2LD, Paul, AC2UQ, started this net at the beginning of the pandemic to keep everybody social and keep everybody communicating. And it has continued, and it's worked out quite well. Every night at 6:30 is the 6:30 check-in net, very similar to the 8:35 net, but a directed net usually runs 2 rounds and closes out where everybody talks about what they did during the day, and if they, once again, need any assistance or have any questions, they're asked at that net. Every Monday night at 8 p.m. is the Undernet, or Ulster and Northern Duchess Readiness Net. Basic idea is emergency services, getting people prepared for what to do in the event of an emergency. If you don't have power, if you don't have internet, if you don't have phone service, what are you going to do? And the net explores many different ways of dealing with emergencies and emergency communications. It gets very creative, and there's actually a lot of technology in it as well. Please join at 8 p.m. Monday nights. Wednesdays at 4:30 p.m., we have an HF net that Paul, AC2UQ, has started, held at 3835 kilohertz or slightly above if that frequency is occupied, at 4:30 p.m. on Wednesdays. Not just for the Overlook Mountain area, but we've had check-ins from adjacent states and further. It's become a nice popular net once a week, 4:30s on Wednesday, 3835 kilohertz. Thursday nights at 8 p.m., our club president, Dave K2GLV, hosts the OMARC Thursday Night Technical Net. This is a technical net like ours, but usually a ham radio related or computer ham radio related topic. Please come at 8 p.m. Dave looks for a topic from the first check-ins or comes up with one himself. The net can run 4 or 5 rotations into the night and usually turns up some really interesting questions and answers. So join us Thursday nights at 8 p.m. And that's it for me. And we return the repeater to its regular use. As usual, I'll hang out for a few minutes if anybody wants to chat, but I am ending the YouTube stream now. Everybody have a great evening.